Hello, folks. Welcome to Inside the Marble Palace. And hey, I'm literally inside the Marble Palace. I am not going to show you the rest of my office because it's legendary for being messy. But you get to see a nice map on the back of me. And I get to introduce my guests. As usual, Ledger host Arthur White Crummy. And joining us this week, our good friend, Zak Vescera from the StarPhoenix. Thank you, Zak. Zak, you're not really all that new anymore, are you, Zak?
I'm middle-aged is how
you're middle-aged. We are, as a great young reporter that has been following COVID quite extensively and has a lot to offer today. But I'm going to start with you right off the top, Arthur, because you were a little closer to the vaccine announcement this week. In a nutshell, what is it? And when will the rollout kind of happen? And how effective do you think it'll be specifically for the political interests of the government? It has to find a way to offer some suggestion to the public right now that it's got a handle on this problem when case numbers are rising.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that they've been very excited about this moment. Whenever they've been asked about restrictions and supports, vaccines have been pretty early to come on their lips as a response. And they've announced now a plan that is going to start as early as next week. We're going to get close to 2,000 doses going to the Regina General Hospital for distribution to healthcare workers. And then we're going to move into priority groups with an expectation of about 200,000 doses going for the next first quarter of 2021. And only in April are we going to see the mass immunization program for the rest of the population. The priority groups that we're going to be seeing are people 80 and over, and then working down in 5-year intervals, people in long-term care and healthcare workers.
Oh, good. I'm close to the top. Guys, why is it being rolled out in Regina? Does anybody know? Somebody asked me this, and I dearly love an answer, but why is it being rolled out at Regina General as opposed to RUH, where things usually happen in terms of Saskatoon? Does anybody know? Sorry if I'm putting you on the spot, but I literally did not get an answer to that question.
I might be able to fill in a little bit there. Sure. One of the things that we were told about this vaccine quite emphatically yesterday is that the Pfizer vaccine, which is a 2-dose vaccine that uses messenger RNA technology, is quite finicky, and one might even say fragile. It has to be stored at ultra cold temperatures of -70. And the explanation that was kind of... actually it's even colder than Saskatoon is normally. And one of the explanations that was given to us yesterday is that wherever this thing arrives, it pretty much, for the time being anyway, should probably stay there. And right now, Regina seems to be the designated delivery site. That does kind of illustrate the challenge that lies ahead, though. If you're immunizing people in long-term care, you need to figure out a way to get that vaccine to long-term care homes. We know government is waiting on delivery of, I believe, 25 portable ultra-cold freezers that might help with that. But it also does outline another big caveat we have going forward here, Murray, which is that this vaccine is probably not well suited for areas outside Saskatoon, Regina, areas where it might be more difficult to transport a vaccine to and to begin.
And that's really critical to the north and other things. I'll get Arthur to speak to that because he wrote about it today. But I want you to carry on with that thought for a moment, Zak, because the big outbreak right now is obviously in Regina, in Parkside, that you've been covering from here. What's the logistics in terms of being able to get that vaccine when we get it to places like that? Obviously, that's not solving the problem immediately at Parkside in extended care in South Regina that you can sort of please describe for the people that might be less familiar. But can you also speak to how it might avoid future outbreaks here and any place else related to seniors? And as you said, the challenge of just actually having to get the vaccine to people, because it's going to be really hard to get people to the vaccine.
Sure. I'll start breaking it down as best I can there. One of the things that was described to us yesterday is that basically as this vaccine arrives, it's just really complicated to unpack it. It's kind of like a really, it's like a Christmas present with lots of different layers on it, and you have to kind of struggle to unwrap it and get the whole thing out. And the logistic challenge that presents for long-term care is it's probably not very feasible to get everyone in a long-term care home. These are some of our most vulnerable people, and line them up and send them all to a hospital and get them inoculated there. It's much more convenient to actually do that on site so that you can vaccinate staff and residents right away. And I think the urgency of that was really highlighted this week when we talk about some of the more devastating outbreaks that we have seen in long-term care. At Parkside, I believe the latest numbers we got yesterday were that 13 residents have passed away. And I think we are officially in the hundreds in the 200s, I think, in terms of staff and residents who have tested positive for COVID-19. Parkside's a large facility. I think it's like 220 something beds. And I believe we were at over 150 residents who tested positive, and I think more than 50 staff there. It was bad enough that they actually transferred 25 residents to Pioneer Village, which is another long-term care home in Regina that's run by the same company. Later, 5 of those residents also tested positive for COVID-19.
Are there specific plans for places? Because in Eastview and Saskatoon, obviously places that you're citing in Regina, we do have in our larger urban centers a critical mass of elderly people in need of this, and that would be first in line. But it's also something that's in every smaller community that has a personal care home and everything. Can you speak just to the strategy of getting those people immunized and what you're hearing from government otherwise, or what you can speculate as to how that rollout might actually happen when you have even within the cities, even within rural Saskatchewan, a pretty large and diverse province in which to get vaccines to specific spots quickly?
Yeah, well, Arthur, if you like, I'll start maybe digging into that, and then Arthur can hop in. I tuned in a bit to a federal press conference yesterday where Major General Danny Fortin, who's running basically the vaccine distribution across Canada, or is I think the vice lead on that, and he called it a masterclass in complexity. The sheer task of getting the vaccine everywhere it needs to go in Canada in the wintertime, by the way. And one of the things that might come out of that, quite frankly, and I know this is definitely the case for many First Nations communities and communities in the North, they might have to wait a little longer until January when we start to get shipments of a vaccine that is produced by the American company Moderna. It's the same efficacy as the Pfizer vaccine, but this vaccine is a little easier to transport and only needs to be stored at -20°C. So it might be a little bit more flexible and a little easier to get into those hard to reach places in Saskatchewan that you've kind of made reference to. In terms of how do you immunize a massive group of very vulnerable people at the same time, I can only speculate on that because this is probably the biggest immunization program that's happened in our lifetimes.
And this way I get you in, Arthur, because a couple things that fascinate me. One is almost the jurisdictional thing, because you're dealing with northern communities, northern First Nation communities, reserve communities. They're a federal responsibility of the federal government basically sending out vaccines to the province to immunize people that are generally under the jurisdiction of federal responsibility, but might not be because they might also be in the cities. It's a challenge for the province to reach these northern communities or more isolated reserve communities, is Zak outlined. You did a story about this today, Arthur. Can you just offer some generalities as to what you learned and what additional things people might want to know about the challenge here?
Well, it was actually Zak who did the story, Murray, but I was there.
We look very similar. It's okay.
But I was there. I was there questioning Mo and Merriman on his behalf, so maybe I can give it a quick stab and then turn it back over to him for some more of his insight. But certainly it was surprising in some ways to see the federal government leave this entirely in the hands of the provinces and to not take any direct role in distributing the vaccine to First Nations. But it was very clear with their advisory group that they wanted to see Indigenous people and First Nations prioritized in the vaccine distribution process by the provinces. And though the province here is saying it's going to prioritize northern communities and also remote communities, it did not specifically mention Indigenous people, which I found to be quite interesting. And when we questioned Merriman and Mo about that, they said that it's just logistically easier to hit some of these remote communities at once. So if you're going to be doing Wollaston Lake, or if you're going to be getting the vaccine to the Lac La Ronge Indian Band, it makes sense to also get it to other communities in the same region. So if Zach wants to continue on that, feel free to go.
My apologies, Zach. Yeah. And it's true, because we have this huge challenge related to just getting stuff out to places that you don't normally get stuff out there. And I know you weren't there for the scrum. My apologies again. But what else did you learn from the process of doing the story, Zach?
I think there's a really big kind of gap in government thinking, frankly, that I think needs to be pointed out. When they answered Arthur's question, the response they gave basically is that, oh, we're hitting the north. We'll catch First Nations communities along the way. There are a lot of First Nations people and Indigenous people who don't live in the north. That's kind of a false equivalency that I think we sometimes refer to in Saskatchewan when we're talking about northern.
All over, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And for example, if you're like, I'm thinking about Saskatoon. We have the Saskatoon Tribal Council and many nations that are just outside Saskatoon's boundaries. And a very large Indigenous population in this city. They're not anywhere to be found, at least on first glance, in this plan, unless they fall into another priority group. And one other thing I noticed about the vaccine presentation from yesterday is that when they talked about their stakeholder group, they made reference to embedding Indigenous representation into that group. That kind of signaled to me that if they're being embedded, they're not there right now. And that was what I heard from the folks at the FSIN. I chatted with Vice Chief David Pratt. He said that Chief Bobby Cameron had reached out to Minister Merriman asking about, hey, when are we going to be at the table? But at the time I spoke to Vice Chief Pratt, and that was on Wednesday, nothing really seemed to be solid at that time. And kind of most surprisingly, I think, Vice Chief Pratt said that his preference would really be to work with the federal government to have a treaty obligation to provide aid in times of famine or pestilence under treaties such as Treaty 6. When I went back to the federal government and asked, hey, what's actually happening here? They told me what Arthur was able to glean, which is that ultimately provinces are the ones who are responsible for distributing the vaccine to First Nations. Once they arrive at those nations, the nations themselves, which actually have quite a lot of experience with vaccination, they learned a lot from H1N1, might take a little bit more leadership there, but they're really waiting on these deliveries, and the province is really the one who's in charge of them right now.
Let's talk. Let's go on a bit more and talk a bit about the numbers that we're now seeing. I'll start with you, Zach. The interesting thing to me is whether or not we are actually leveling off or not. And it's hard to explain to people exactly what that means, because cases are obviously rising. The 7-day average is rising, but it's not rising quite as rapidly as maybe it was before. And if that is the case, what is the government telling us that in terms of what that means and how it might work into various strategies of the government to start dealing with COVID going forward at this particular point?
Arthur, do you want to start off?
Well, yeah. So I've been looking at the numbers, obviously, and you're right, Murray. That there does seem to be a little bit of a stabilization. We've seen the 7-day average sort of jumping around between 260 and 275 over the month of December. That's obviously higher than it was at the end of November, but it doesn't appear to be growing exponentially anymore. And Mo specifically referenced that during his press conference yesterday when he backtracked on, he was clear that he's no longer contemplating with a great deal of confidence the prospect of loosening some of these restrictions on
ambiguous language possible.
Yes. It's still not clear. He refused to rule it out. He just said that it's improbable. And so we're not going to have the possibility necessarily of seeing grandma at the long-term care home or of having 10 people over for Christmas. But this still remains to be determined. He's waiting on a recommendation for Dr. Shahab that's set to come on December 17th. This comes as Alberta is obviously implementing much stricter measures. Scott Moe does not seem yet to be willing to go in that direction, though he signaled that it is, of course, possible that harsher measures could be coming after the December date, but that's not at all clear.
I'm curious about that. I'm actually writing about it today. When he defers to Dr. Shahab and when he doesn't is going to be an increasing source of fascination to me. Quite often, we've all sat there listening to them in scrums when they've deferred to the doctor, but occasionally both Health Minister Merriman and Premier Moe have contradicted Dr. Shahab, or at least contradicted what I think is Dr. Shahab's cautionary message about whatever's happening, particularly as it relates to openings, what should or shouldn't be done in terms of businesses, shopping. It was really bad about 2-3 weeks ago when Dr. Shahab was basically saying, if you have to go shopping, get in and out as quickly as possible, while the Premier and other people, including the Chamber of Commerce, through taxpayers' money and otherwise, were presenting the idea of going shopping. I get the problem. It's a horrible thing for business right now. And I get that it's very frustrating and their very livelihoods are on the line. But is there going to now be something more resembling a consistency in messaging that maybe we haven't seen in the past? And is the Premier really deferring to Dr. Shahab, or is he kind of just sort of slowly building to the notion that we're about to hear something very unpopular that we don't want to hear, which is, as you described, we won't be able to see Grandma at Christmas, or we won't even be able to gather in large gatherings. What's your sense in terms, I guess I'll start with you, Arthur, in terms of a political strategy here, in terms of the messaging that you're hearing? Are we building towards that inevitability and we're just seeing the Premier want to have somebody else say it before he has to, that, you got to stay home for Christmas?
Yeah, no, it's clear that they've been trying to throw the responsibility of this onto Dr. Shahab whenever possible. We hear that again and again in question period. Almost every answer to the opposition's questions is, we are following the advice of our chief medical health officer. So it's become a very useful political screen for the government. And Dr. Shahab seems to be taking it very magnanimously, though occasionally he has been a little bit more willing to put a little bit of daylight between himself and the Premier, more than I'd seen in the past. Yes, it's going to be politically unpopular to force people to endure all of these, all of these restrictions through the Christmas season. But I actually think that the Premier played it surprisingly well, because now he comes out as the person who is at least trying to make an effort to save Christmas. And it's not his fault. It's Dr. Shahab's fault, or the numbers' fault, or something else. And Ryan Miley is now the leader who was much more bullish about wanting to steal Christmas from the people. I mean, that's the way that the Saskatchewan party can spin it. Ryan Miley is the Grinch, even though he's the one who was from the beginning squarely facing up to what the modeling and what the numbers were telling us.
And Zach, what do you see in the modeling numbers? Because you're closer to people in Saskatoon who are really intensely watching these numbers and
nerds. They're called nerds. Call them what they are.
Yeah, we're all a little that way, sadly, in this conversation, buddy. Yeah, but I'm struggling to understand myself if the modeling numbers are telling me that we're leveling off or not. From what you've gathered, what's your best guess? And obviously, it is a guess. You can't tell.
Well, here's the thing. I think that your intuition is correct, that there is a little bit of a leveling off happening. And keep in mind that we're also expecting what's being called a correction in the numbers to come soon. Basically, there's a backlog of people who have recovered.
This is the cases you're talking about, obviously.
Yes. Of people who have recovered but haven't been recorded as such. So our active case count is overrepresented. This isn't a conspiracy. Manitoba's done this a couple times. Don't freak out when the numbers suddenly drop, folks. But here's the thing, even if we're leveling off, we are not leveling off, and Dr. Shahab has said this, SHA CEO Scott Livingston said this, we're not leveling off at a sustainable place. When you level off at 250, it's kind of like you slow down while you're still doing $150 on the highway in icy conditions, right? So you might not be going any faster, but you're not going at a pace where the health system can sustainably keep up without other health services being affected and without the economy basically being put in stranglehold. I've been chatting a lot with folks in the restaurant and hospitality industry in Saskatoon and elsewhere. And a big thing that they're saying right now is that, and this was touched on yesterday in I think, question period, is that the restrictions right now aren't killing them, but 65% of them are actively losing money right now. That's the latest number from Restaurants Canada. So they're not really making enough cash to like keep their doors sustainably open. They're kind of caught in this, stuck in the middle of you situation. So even if we do see some leveling off happening in the numbers, it's not enough to give much hope of any restrictions being lifted on December 17th. Dr. Shahab's actually hinted the opposite, that there might be more coming down the pipeline. And it's not enough to get things back to normal. And by the way, neither is going to be the first inoculations of this vaccine. As Arthur mentioned, we're looking at 200,000 doses or so in the first quarter. That's 100,000 people, or less than 10% of the population. We're going to be wearing masks for a long time, and it's good. It's a good idea to just hunker yourself down and get into that mentality right now, I think.
That's a good summary, and I think unfortunately we're going to have to leave it off from there. Thanks so much, guys. Thanks for doing this. And I don't know when we'll be back inside the Marble Palace, but I hope everybody will just join us whenever that is. Merry Christmas, folks, if we don't see you before.
And happy holidays.
Christmas.